Welcome to the New Jersey Climate Change Resource Center Fall Climate Academy's webinar on protecting historic residences from flooding with a focus on building elevations. My name is Marjorie Kaplan, and I'm both Associate Director of the Rutgers Climate Institute, and along with my colleague Jean Herb of the Edward Blaustein School of Planning and Public Policy, I co-direct the New Jersey Climate Change Resource Center. A few logistics. Today's webinar will last until 1:30. Other than today's presenters and our Rutgers team, you're all muted, so to communicate with us, please type your questions into the chat box. To find the chat box, look at the bottom of the screen and you'll see a little bubble that says chat, and if you click on that, you can send us questions and comments. Please send your notes to all panelists, as that ensures all of us working behind the scenes today will see your questions. Thanks to my colleagues Matt Drews and Dr. Carrie Ferraro here at Rutgers for their help with today's webinar. We welcome your thoughts and questions. I also want to let you know we're recording today's webinar, and it will be available on the New Jersey Climate Change Resource Center website, which I'll put into the chat box in a second. One continuing education credit is available through the Association of State Floodplain Management, and 1.5 certification maintenance credits are available through the American Planning Association. We're very pleased to present today's webinar by Kate Marcopul and Dominique Hawkins. This is the last in a 3-part series on climate change and historic preservation for New Jersey. You can find the first 2 webinars in this series on the website that I'll put in the chat box. A little bit about our speakers. Kate Marcopul is administrator of the New Jersey Historic Preservation Office, where she's worked since 1998. Among her many responsibilities over that time, Dr. Markopol has supervised the project review and National Register and Community Assistance sections of the New Jersey Historic Preservation Office. She's reviewed projects for impacts to archaeologic resources under federal and state law and assisted in the development of New Jersey's statewide comprehensive historic preservation plan. Kate holds a PhD and an MA in anthropology from Temple University. And Kate is going to speak on the regulatory basics for historic preservation and climate adaptation. After Kate, she'll be followed by Dominique Hawkins, a principal with Preservation Design Partnership, a planning and design practice focusing on nationally significant historic sites and buildings. Dominique is nationally recognized for her pioneering work in developing design guidelines for historic communities and districts throughout the country, as well as elevation design guidelines for historic properties and flood mitigation guides for historic properties, including New Jersey. Dominique holds a Master of Science in Historic Preservation and a Master of Architecture, both from the University of Pennsylvania. It's now my pleasure to invite Dr. Kate Marcopol to turn on her camera, her microphone, and to put her slide deck up. Thank you.
Can everybody hear me okay? Okay.
We can hear you.
Okay, great. So, good afternoon, everybody. Let's see if I can share my screen. My name is Kate Marcopol, and I'm the administrator of the Historic Preservation Office. And, I understand there's often confusion about what gets reviewed at the state level. So I'm here today to discuss when the Historic Preservation Office would review a project, particularly a flood adaptation project. So in New Jersey, there are generally 3 situations in which the Historic Preservation Office would be involved in reviewing a flood adaptation project. Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, the New Jersey Register of Historic Places Act, and either freshwater wetlands permits, CAFRA permits, or waterfront development permits that are issued by the Department of Environmental Protection's Land Use Regulation Program. I'm going to talk very generally about each of these requirements, just in the interest of allowing more time for Dominique to speak. But if you have any questions, please feel free to ask me at the end of today's webinar. So Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act applies to projects receiving federal funding, permitting, or licensing. And in my experience, elevation of historic buildings often qualifies for federal funding. Most often, elevations can be funded by FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or HUD, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. But generally, Section 106 applies whenever there is a federal action. The New Jersey Register of Historic Places Act requires that all public agencies that may have an effect on a New Jersey Register listed property get prior authorization from the Commissioner of the DEP. So in New Jersey, buildings listed on the New Jersey Register of Historic Places are protected from public action. And, this would be a county or a state agency or a municipal agency or any instrumentality thereof that would have obligations if they're planning a project that may affect a resource listed on the New Jersey Register of Historic Places. So what does that mean? The law applies if these three circumstances exist. You represent a public agency, there's a New Jersey Register listed property in your project area, your project might affect the listed property either directly or indirectly. With regard to flood adaptation, if there is state funding that's being used in the flood adaptation of a building that's listed in the New Jersey Register of Historic Places, then review under New Jersey Register of Historic Places Act would be required, and the Historic Preservation Office staff administers the review of that project. Or sometimes in New Jersey, there have been municipalities that have been applying for funding from FEMA or from HUD to elevate a historic building that's listed on the New Jersey Register of Historic Places. In that circumstance, review under the New Jersey Register of Historic Places Act would be required, in addition to review under Section 106 of the Historic Preservation Act. So there could be times where the Historic Preservation Office would be involved in multiple reviews of a specific, or should I say, multiple regulatory contexts for one individual project. So, the easiest way to determine whether there is a resource listed on the New Jersey Register of Historic Places is to consult our website. We update this list on a quarterly basis, and you can see the web address right there. It's organized by county and municipality. If you still have a question about whether you have a property listed on the registers, you can feel free to contact me or to contact the office. But this is certainly the quickest way to be able to go and do that from your desk. The Historic Preservation Office would also be consulted by the Division of Land Use Regulation if they received an application for a freshwater wetlands permit or a permit under the Coastal Area Facilities Review Act, or they received an application for a waterfront development permit. In particular, certainly we have reviewed elevation projects within all these various contexts. But all of these review processes have the same common principles associated with them. So they're all based on the presumption that the presence of historic properties benefits the public. All of these regulatory processes also encourage public involvement, and the public is given an opportunity to comment on a proposed project or to share their comments with the Historic Preservation Office on a proposed project. Many of the processes also start with identifying whether you have historic properties or whether the project affects historic properties. And then there's the consideration of the particular effect or impact that a proposed project, in today's case, maybe specifically an elevation, might have on a historic property. And then if there is an adverse impact that's anticipated as part of the project on the historic resource, then there's an analysis about potential ways that we could avoid, minimize, or mitigate that impact. All of the review processes, and I'm talking about Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, the New Jersey Register of Historic Places Act, and the permits that we are consulted about from the Division of Land Use Regulation, use what we call the standards in evaluating the projects. So the same standards are used no matter what regulatory context the Historic Preservation Office is reviewing a project under. And those standards, when we talk about standards, we're referring to the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation. And that's what you see on the slide right here. So they're used in evaluating projects, regardless of whether it's a Section 106 review, a New Jersey Register of Historic Places Act review, or permitting through the Division of Land Use Regulation. Recently, the National Park Service has issued guidelines for flood adaptation for rehabilitating historic buildings. And you can see the general guidelines bulleted on this slide. Now, the HPO would consult these guidelines in conjunction with the Secretary of the Interior standards in evaluating flood adaptation projects that require review under any of the regulatory contexts that I mentioned previously. So one question that many folks ask is, what is the threshold for when a historic district or a historic property has sustained so much change that it's no longer eligible for listing on the National Register of Historic Places or the New Jersey Register of Historic Places? Well, there's no one answer to this question. Elevation is a relatively new phenomenon when you're looking at the history of historic preservation in the country. And the Historic Preservation Office has not yet conducted any case studies of particular historic properties or historic districts that have been elevated or otherwise flood adapted. But I thought I would mention a few points that might be considered when you're trying to protect the integrity of a historic district at the local level. And I'm hopeful that maybe Dominique will cover these in more detail in her presentation. So in our observation in the Historic Preservation Office, it seems like the integrity of a historic district might be best preserved when historic buildings within the district are elevated to a consistent height, as opposed to having different buildings being elevated to different heights within the same historic district. Also, we think it's important to think about what new construction within a historic district will look like. New construction is going to have to conform to various flood adaptation requirements and resiliency requirements. And it's important to think about how they will fit into the historic district when they're built. So that concludes my portion of the presentation for today. And I think we're going to do the question and answer period at the end. So I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have after Dominique has finished her presentation.
Thank you so much, Kate, for a wonderful presentation. So yes, we'll turn it over to Dominique to share the screen, her screen, please.
So good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to do, Kate, thank you for that great introduction. I'm going to be picking up on a lot of the points you mentioned. So you did a great segue to me. Thanks. I want to frame this conversation by saying this is primarily a presentation about historic residential buildings. Although a lot of what we're talking about can be applied to commercial buildings. It's a difficult, there are other challenges for commercial buildings, and there are also other possibilities for commercial buildings. So let's begin. And I am not advancing, I apologize. Let's see here. Okay. So if people are interested in getting in AIA credits, I understand you can self-report. Here are the learning objectives, and we're going to be really just talking about historic buildings in the context of flooding. So one of the things I want to just start with, and I apologize for those who have attended previous sessions, but I think it's important to have context here. The historic buildings tend to be built near waterways. Communities can take actions to actually mitigate the effect of that water on buildings by doing things like a dam. This is a dam project actually in Exeter, New Hampshire. I took the second photograph a week ago or 2 weeks ago. And there are also different kinds of flooding to consider. And it's important to know what kind of flooding impacts a property because it actually has an impact on the type of mitigation that you'll want to consider. So nuisance flooding, also known as persistent flooding, is that water that you get when you have a high tide. Coastal flooding tends to also include very high winds and wave action, meaning waves that are hitting the foundations of buildings, and that impacts what you can or should be doing at your building foundations. There's also the possibility of what's called ice dams, which is when ice will block, for example, underneath a bridge opening, and then it would back up the water behind it. That's referred to as an ice jam. Riverine flooding is when a river floods. This is actually near my office. And if you look at the follow the deck, this was August. So riverine flooding is when the river water rises and impacts historic buildings. You can also just get rain on a body of water, such as a lake, and the lake rises, affecting the properties around it. So the National Flood Insurance Program, which was founded in 1968, makes flood insurance available to both residential and commercial property owners. And it's insurance for both the property itself as well as its contents. So the level of risk of a property, so if a property is in a higher risk area, the cost of that flood insurance is going to be higher than if it's in a lower risk property or a lower risk zone. So one of the things about the National Flood Insurance Program, which makes it I'll say, topic of discussion for a lot of people, is if you are purchasing a home with an FDIC-backed mortgage, you are required to have flood insurance. So the cost of that flood insurance is something that people have to add into their effective cost of owning a home. So people are incentivized to reduce that cost, obviously, as an expenditure. And the National Flood Insurance Program, which offers the flood insurance, wants to minimize its risk so that it's not paying out money. And part of that is because by act of Congress, the National Flood Insurance Company must be financially self-sustaining. So what that means is they are supposed to be taking in as much money in premiums as they are paying out in premiums. So one of the essential problems with that is if you look back to events like Katrina and Harvey and Sandy and keep naming all of these storms, the National Flood Insurance Program is paying out a lot more money than it has been getting in historically. So they are currently raising their rates dramatically, which is having a big impact on homeowners. So one of the things that the National Flood Insurance program does, it actually develops flood insurance rate maps. So it maps out where properties are more vulnerable than less vulnerable, again, tying it to flood insurance rates. There are variances for historic structures built into the program. And basically the variance says if you're going to do something that makes a historic building non-historic, no longer qualifying to be historic, you might be able to be exempted from the requirement to mitigate the property, meaning protect it from floods. Doesn't make the property any safer. It actually, in my mind, increases vulnerability. And some local ordinances actually don't allow or don't permit a variance for historic properties. So like historic preservation, flood mitigation is a locally regulated subject. So what does a flood insurance rate map look like? This is Long Beach, and this is an online service. You can actually go online and type in your address and get a flood insurance rate map for your address. So this is Long Branch or Long Beach, New Jersey. So a couple of the key things to look at is that the flood insurance rate maps are based upon historical data. So what they do is they go back over time and say, over the last X number of years, how many times is it flooded? How likely is this area to flood again? Areas that flood fairly regularly, and then historically it was known as the 100-year flood. It became known as the 1% flood, now known as a special flood hazard area, same thing, have a 1 in 100 chance of flooding every year based upon historical data. Why am I specifically saying historical data? It doesn't include climate change or sea level rise. So if you look at this map on the left, my pointer is working here. So the AE zone on the left, A is when you see A, think about bathtub water rising. So it's just rising up. When you get into VE zones, any V, think about velocity. So this has wave action. And then there's AO zones in here. And the O is a standing water depth, is the way to think about it. And so that's one foot. So the 9 feet here and the 13 feet here are relative to a vertical datum. And it's hard to translate that into how many feet above where my house is going to flood. But usually you need a surveyor to help you with that. So there's a couple terms that I want you to be familiar with. One of them is base flood elevation, and the other is design flood elevation. So base flood elevation is the flood based upon the 1% chance of flooding in any given year. So the special flood hazard area. Design flood elevation says we're going to put a factor of safety on that 1% flood. And as a community, again, locally, we're going to say that we want to increase that by 1 or 2 feet in addition to the base flood, so that we are establishing a height for which we can have greater protection, understanding that there is climate change and sea level rise. That additional height is known as freeboard. And if you go to floodsmart.gov, you can download the maps for a specific area. So one of the things that to keep in mind is that this is historical data. So the official FEMA estimate, this is the New York Times article from June of this year, the official FEMA estimate for flood risk is on the left, based upon their firm maps, so those flood insurance rate maps. Independent researchers' new estimates are on the right, which says a lot more of the country, particularly the parts in the middle, are vulnerable to flooding than is documented under FEMA. So why does it matter? People's flood insurance rates are going up so that the National Flood Insurance Program can be self-sustainable. So individual property owners are making choices and then looking at their rates go up about how to change their properties to try and reduce those rates. For historic properties, or people who are concerned about historic preservation, it also matters because there are going to be changes to some of the buildings and places we care about. So one of the ways that you can quickly check your particular property's vulnerability is, I just noticed this, I think this went live November 1st. If you look at the bottom right-hand corner, down here, Realtor.com started publishing flood factors for different properties. And if you click on this link, it can help you actually calculate what your flood insurance premium will be today if you were to purchase this house. It also will give you some basic flood information about how much the adjacent properties in your neighborhood or the neighborhood you're considering have flooded. And you can scroll around. So even if you don't want to buy this house, but it's for sale down the street or around the corner, you can actually get some good information about your own house by clicking on this website. And I learned today that Rutgers actually provided some of the information for New Jersey properties to include on the site. So another way to learn about historic property flood vulnerability is to take at your local municipal level, if there's mapping, GIS mapping of individual historic properties, and you overlay that with flood information, you can then start to see whether or not your property is at risk. If your community doesn't have it, you want to investigate on your own, New Jersey Flood Mapper is a fantastic tool that actually allows you to look at all areas of the state in New Jersey and map it for potential flood risk. You can also include sea level rise. So what the anticipated increased height of the sea will be and the impact on the landmass. So this example actually has 2 feet of sea level rise. And I picked 2 feet because there's a 17% likelihood that by 2050, the sea level in New Jersey will rise by 2 feet. It is 50% by 2070. So that's a 50-year, that's 50 years away. This also and you can also drive down into individual properties and use the same information. This is an example from Cape May. But one of the things we have to think about is that the sea is rising at faster and faster rates over time, and it's difficult to predict exactly what the sort of outcome will be on any given year. So I like this graphic from the state, from sealevelrise.org, and this is for Delaware, which said basically took 35 years for the sea to rise 6 inches, and the next 6 inches, they're anticipating it rising in just 14 years. That's an incredible difference. So how do you know your own flood risk? Obviously, the property at the top of the hill has less flood risk than the property at the bottom of the hill. There are lots of ways to mitigate the flood risk of all of the properties, but we have to figure out which is the one that is historically most acceptable to us. So option B, which includes raising the house very high and including garages at the first floor and eliminating porches, is probably going to be the least acceptable option for preservationists. But I think whereas option C might be okay, option D, where you're really starting to get higher than you would like, but understanding that's where the threat is, is it still okay? That's something to think about. So in looking at residential mitigation options, there are a few different kinds of things you can do. I'm going to focus on some of the basic things that every property owner can do, and then we'll get into some of the more complicated things which take architectural engineering services to make them happen. So one of the basic things everyone can do is they can do some improvements to their own landscape. And the central goal of landscape improvements is really maintaining all the water that falls on your site. So think about having zero runoff to anywhere else. So everything that falls on your roof, on your parking driveways, parking areas, walkways, etc., all gets permeated back on your own site. This actually sounds a lot like LEED design, energy efficient, green design processes. So things like rain gardens, where you have native plants absorbing water that's coming off the road, as well as anything that's sheeting off the grass. This example has a downspout coming off a roof that's supplying water to a rain garden, again planted with native plants. You can also collect it in a vessel or known as a rain barrel and use it to water your own landscape. And they can be beautiful. They don't have to be horrible. Another option is looking at permeable surfaces, so walkways with soil in between, which allow stormwater to percolate down into the soil, and gravel paved parking areas. Other examples. Should also use native plants and big trees. So trees actually big trees actually drive water down deep into the soil, and native plants are beneficial in that they can tolerate the local conditions, requiring less water as well as less pesticides. So when considering doing mitigation options to buildings, so getting away from the landscape, one of the things to keep in mind is a building that is in poor condition is a bad candidate for any flood mitigation project. So basic maintenance is actually a key part of mitigating historic buildings. Some of the things that we can do, and these are things that can also just happen as you're doing the work. So if you're going to be replacing your boiler that's in your basement, if that's a vulnerable area, then that boiler can actually be put up on a higher floor and taken out of harm's way. Having major equipment in a house that fails as a result of a flood is extraordinarily costly to fix. At the same time, you're trying to fix a lot of other things in the building that need your attention. In addition, certain building systems will help in the recovery from a flood if they are maintained and continue to work. Electrical service is one. Being able to blow air, whether through a air conditioning or air handling system, or even just plugging in a fan, is helpful, as is having good clean water for cleanup purposes. So in this example, this building was flooded out. So what they are doing is they're literally moving all the electrical and plumbing utilities further up on the wall before they sheetrock it in anticipation of the next potential flood. We also have to think about what recovery options mean. So local historic districts have been reluctant to accept solar panels. Solar panels can provide electricity again to blow a fan after a flood event occurs, or even maintain food in a refrigerator. So having a solar panel available doesn't make a homeowner dependent on whether or not the local municipality can get electricity up and running after a flood event. So is there a way, from a local preservation commission point of view, that we can accept solar panels as part of our understanding of our historic districts that would allow buildings to recover in the event of a flood? On the right is actually a generator, and it's tucked back in the hill and is, I'll say, screened as much as possible, but that's another way to achieve energy independence after a flood. We also have to think about how we deal with our buildings and recover from flooding as quickly as possible. One way is to put a sump pump in. So this is usually in a basement, collects water and pumps water out. So adding a sump pump into a basement can be helpful in terms of recovery. On the right, this is a building I visited about 3 weeks ago, and they had a flood. And so what they did was they pulled their baseboard up, squeegeed down their floor, and let it dry out. So being able to recover may mean accepting that maybe it will get wet, but how am I going to facilitate the recovery after it does? So when they go to put the baseboard back in on this building, one of the things you're talking about is, can they put it in a way that allows them to take it off quickly, to allow that drying process to begin faster the next time. So principally, this talk is going to really focus on building elevations. And hopefully, I'll provide you with some tips for doing better examples than this one. Ideally, building elevation should focus on providing resilience and safety to the property owners without greatly altering the historic character of the building, but also the surrounding district. We always think in context in preservation. So what is building elevation? So to do a building elevation, the Structural beams are put in under a house, a building. It is disconnected from its foundation. All of the piping, wiring, everything that is feeding from your basement up is disconnected. And the house is then raised up slowly to a desired height. Once it is in position, foundations are built. The house is supported on those foundations. All of the building systems are then reconnected. And then the house sits on this raised elevation. So for a property owner, there's a lot of expense in going through all of those steps. And yes, they can be paid for or partially paid for by someone like Fema, but in any case, it's a lot of money, and it's a trying process, to say the least. There is very little difference from the perspective of a property owner to raise a house 4 feet versus 8 feet. The cost is essentially a few additional concrete plots. However, if I'm a property owner, if I can raise it 8 feet and get a garage under my house, particularly in an area that may be difficult to park, like a shore town, then that could be a great advantage. So property owners generally want to go as high as they can possibly go to allow them to benefit from the space that is found space under their house. The problem with that is that in a historic context, it's often that the illustration I showed earlier, it's often jarring and removes important historical features like front porches. I don't know where the base flood elevation line is or the design flood elevation for this particular residence, but the higher buildings get and removed from the ground with no context or no attachment to the ground, they start to look like they're floating in air. And I'm sure this will be finished beautifully, and I didn't see it finished, but I think it illustrates the point well. So what are the options? So for the options for zone A, and zone A are those inland areas where the water is basically rising like a bathtub and we don't have waves coming in. You can either put the house up on fill, so basically increase the height of the soil and then set the house on top of that as the first example. You can have a perimeter wall or crawl space with what's called flood openings or flood vents on the side, which allow the water to go in and out to equalize the pressure on both sides of the wall. You can, if you have a basement, you generally have to abandon the basement. And to abandon the basement properly, you actually need to fill it in. And the reason you need to fill it in is because the pressure of those walls with water on the outside can actually collapse the walls. So fill in the basement. What do you fill it with? Something like gravel. Install flood vents, again, equalizing the pressure on both sides, and raise the lowest floor above the base flood elevation. The other option is to have it on piers or piles, which is open, which really lets the water flow through. Now you can on piers and piles also put lattice and foundation screening to make it look more connected to the ground, and we'll see some examples of that. So this house is raised above the grade. If you look at it, where the steps are, the top landing and the steps, the first floor of that house is all the way up here. So, but the house, because of that perimeter wall and landscaping, and also the slight grade change in the landscape, it still looks very connected to the ground. Similar example, smaller scale. So the house, the first floor level's up here, and this there's a series of steps that come up through the landscape to arrive at that first floor level. So in this example, this house was raised. So if you look carefully, there are these little openings along the edge, not these, which were where the building was physically picked up. But these are flood openings which allow the water to go in and out around the perimeter of the foundation. This is what a flood opening looks like. So, and they have to occur on at least two sides of the building, preferably opposite sides, and it allows water to come in and out, equalizing the pressure on both sides of the wall. So this is actually a house that's fully on piers, and if you look at the lattice on the sides, not only the porch, but on the main house, water is allowed to pass in and out, and the lattice screening is sacrificial. So if larger waves or water with velocity moves through, the lattice will go away, but the house will remain standing. This is a house on pile. This is not a historic house, it's new construction. But when you think about how high you have to get to the front door, so to speak, you have to start to really look at much larger community issues and whether or not the community can support this height. And what do I mean by that? It's not just whether or not you can physically do it. I'll tell you, as an architect, you can lift anything. That's not really the question. It's whether or not the water, sewer, roads, and all the things you need to live in this community will exist if the overall water level was so high as to necessitate the house to be this tall. So when you're looking at residential mitigation options for elevation, one of the most challenging things to consider is the size of the lot. So the smaller the lot is, and particularly the shorter the distance between the sidewalk or the street edge and the front door, it makes it a lot harder to elevate taller. And let me explain why. So on these top examples, you have large lots, and depending on the height you're elevating, you can comfortably fit a set of stairs. The smaller these lots get, like at the bottom, the harder it is to fit a set of stairs. So for the purposes of the New Jersey guide, what we looked at was a bunch of case studies of different types of houses and elevated them. And one of the serious considerations was how tall do the stairs need to be? So if we are if we are raising a house about 2'4" above adjacent grade, there are a couple examples of stairs. Pretty straightforward, pretty simple. By the time we get to 4'8" above adjacent grade, the stairs get a lot more elongated, and in some place we started to look at turning stairs and things like that. If you have to elevate 7 feet above grade, and keep in mind that's not even the height of needed for a garage, it gets a lot harder to configure that many stairs. So stairs take up a lot of space. That's the message I'm giving you. But it also changes the essential character of the building. And its relationship of porches to streets and sidewalks are all affected by the elevation. Here's an example. So this front door is probably about 8 feet above grade. That's a lot of stair to get up. And is that house still visually linked to the street? I will say, once I think the landscaping grows in, it will seem a lot more grounded. Well, right now, it seems like it's almost floating in air. In this case, the stair was put to the side of the porch, allowing that full run so you can get up without crossing across the front elevation of the building, and also minimizing the enjoyability of that little porch space underneath. There's also a problem of accessibility. So if a member of a family doesn't have the ability to walk up a full flight of stairs, or somebody visiting doesn't have the ability, you have to start looking at ramps. Ramps take up a lot more room than stairs. So for 70 feet of, 7 feet of elevation, it translates into over 70 feet of ramp. if you're actually meeting code. So some of the things to consider when you're looking at how to address the need for stairs and getting up to the front of the building and elongating those stairs is, if you elevate, can you maintain the access, the historic access? So in this case, there were a few landscape stairs which kind of kept that height down, and that central access to the front door is maintained. There's also lattice screening underneath the porch to make it feel more solid, and it's complementary to the style of the building. And as some of the landscaping grows in, it will be less visible. Here's another example. So you can tell that this house was elevated. If you look on the side, you can see the flood vents on the side. Again, we had some gravel to absorb some of the runoff from the driveway. And that screening is a sacrificial element. So one of the things I also will point out is that we're seeing brick at these foundations. The acceptable structural materials for elevation are either poured concrete or filled concrete block. Brick, however, can be used to make the foundation as basically a veneer. You can use whole bricks, but you can use it as a veneer to be more historically compatible to the architectural style of the building. So in this example, the yellow house has been elevated. The challenge was that the house is historic. This example is from Maryland, and originally had a front loaded stair that came straight in off the street. So the stair used to be oriented this way, in the same way as this one, its adjacent neighbors. Well, when they elevated it, if they had kept that same orientation, you would have been basically stepping out into the street. So they turned it 90 degrees and created a double stair. But that symmetry actually helped to focus your attention back on that front door, and you're landing and turning into the front door. So that's a way of maintaining access in a tight situation. In addition, the foundation is actually poured concrete, but it's colored, it's colored brick color, so that it is more in keeping with what was historically there. They could also choose to do a brick veneer on top, but at least visually, it starts to, if we go back, it feels like it belongs on the streetscape. Again, context being important. So a lot of this is actually regulated at the local level. And that's whether or not the State Historic Preservation Office is included in a review depends on, as Kate pointed out, the financial incentives or relationship of the mitigation effort. But local historical commissions have to deal with this on a local level in addressing changes to buildings within their historic districts. So one of the things we did for the guide was actually show case studies of elevating buildings to different heights relative to where that base flood design flood elevation level was. So there's a building on the right in each case, and what we do is we keep elevating the building on the left and try and think about it in the context of how do we make it visually feel like it's not quite 7 feet tall. So we did it for different building types, different distances of building to street, to say, okay, if you have a building that has a street front entrance and porches, etc., that push that further out towards the street, and we start to go up, what can we do to make it appear like the building not only as a design element is keeping true to its origins, but also doesn't look grossly different than its context. And yes, 7 feet is a lot. 7 feet is hard to mitigate. But in looking at different styles and types of buildings, I think you can see that you can do certain things, not only again in the stair, but also doing things like introducing blind openings so that it appears as if the building may have been built that way originally or close to it. In all of these examples, we have really simplified things like railings and we're not showing any landscaping or other mitigation just to allow it you to focus on just the building elevation itself. But the hope would be that all of the buildings in the historic district would have a similarly established height to which the historic district commission, the local commission, would say, you know, we want our buildings in our district to be 1 feet above the base flood elevation or 3 feet above the base flood elevation, and not let each house have a different answer for each property owner. We dared to look at mid-century modern, which is very hard because slab on grade is actually one of the hardest, and 1 story is harder to elevate than some more traditional buildings. So, and the other thing to consider is if in elevating a building, you know, people want to do things like add garages or add bonus space underneath, but they do it where it's least visible to the public way. So it's not that it's impossible to have garage or make better use of some of the space under a building, but you don't necessarily want it to be the dominant feature on a streetscape, and you don't want to eliminate important architectural features such as porches from the fronts of buildings. And as Kate mentioned, you also have to consider new construction. So new construction has to be built to meet all current flood requirements. So flood requirements today say that any use that is within that flood zone of that base flood or design flood elevation, uses that are allowable in that zone are parking, storage, and entrances. So the buildings left of this to the left both meet current floodplain requirements in this municipality. Unfortunately, in terms of the context of what it looks like with its historic neighbor, it's an unfortunate intervention in that neighborhood. This is not actually a designated historic district, locally designated historic district. And, you know, unfortunately, architects aren't necessarily helping themselves. So what's allowable at the base is parking down here, entrance, which can be here. You see cars down there, and storage. So, you know, you can keep your lawnmowers and barbecue grills there, but there are better ways to treat the base of a building than this. So in thinking about it from a local historical commission point of view, what are the things you could build in your local commission process, ordinance, or design guidelines to help you mitigate some of these challenges? So one of the things that is another option for residential property owners is called wet floodproofing. So again, the uses below the flood elevation, I'm sorry, my slides got out of order. The uses below the base flood elevation are parking, storage, and entrance. You have to have the flood openings on both sides of the wall to let the water in and out. You have to use flood resistant materials, and all your building systems and equipment have to be above grade. It's also a good idea to have secondary water evacuation areas like some pumps to get whatever flood water that comes in out of the building. So this is an example of residential floodproofing in Philadelphia. Not exactly architecturally inspiring from my point of view, but it meets the criteria. So first floors are here, storage there. Around the back of this building is an alley, and there's parking. Oh, sorry about that. There's parking at that grade level. So there's parking at about this level behind, and then this gets you down to the sidewalk. This is a much better example in Baltimore. So this house actually, on the right, was severely damaged. So the back portion of the building was very compromised. So the local historical commission allowed the back portion of the building to be removed and rebuilt. So this is the back of that building. But if you go down and look at the first floor and the basement of this has actually been filled in, but they maintain the appearance of the historic basement window openings. The first floor has been turned into storage, and on the back, it's parking. So the family can enter through the front door and go upstairs where their living space is, and they have these lovely, balconies on the back, and then they park their cars below. So this is an acceptable option for residential buildings. One of the problems with wet floodproofing is the material of the buildings actually has to be masonry or concrete. This doesn't work with wood frame buildings, although it can work with a building where the foundation, if you have a building where the first floor of the building is masonry and the upper floors are wood frame, that's a possibility. But wood framing, because wood siding is so porous, or shingles, water will go in and out, and it's difficult to dry out. It doesn't necessarily have the structural capacity to address the water pressure. So dry flood proofing is another option for buildings, although it is not compliant for residential buildings under the National Flood Insurance Program. So not compliant. What is dry flood proofing? The best way, this is an example from Baltimore, so historic building obviously in the front, building an addition on the back. This used to be a former recreation center that they turned into a hotel. So the rooms were being built on the back, on a pier in Baltimore. So this is a very, very wet environment, and the water levels went 11 feet. I think they had to floodproof to 11 feet. So what is dry floodproofing? Dry floodproofing is essentially wrapping the building in a wetsuit in all of its areas where it's vulnerable to being flooded. So in terms of a wetsuit, what you're doing is you're trying to keep every drop of water out. It's an enormous task. Requires incredible engineering to make it happen. So if you think about all of the cracks and penetrations in a building, you are trying to keep every drop of water out. So construction types, again, only masonry and concrete buildings. You have to use a lot of things like wall and slab sealers. That means that the walls themselves have to be as waterproof as possible, as well as the floor slab in the lowest floor level. And you're using joint sealers, you're filling in every possible hole. So on the left is a historic building, one of my projects where we were trying to dry floodproof it, but this is an example of a rubble foundation where we had to purge it and waterproof the outside of the wall. So you have to excavate a trench around the building to make sure that no water is getting into the perimeter wall. But you also have to go and look at every potential crack, including around every penetration, such as a hose bib, and make sure that water can't come in there. In this example on the left, this is a building that was flooding regularly, and the Baltimore Historic Preservation Commission said, after it had flooded multiple times, it was a coffee shop, and they kept losing equipment and furniture and everything. They said, okay, we understand that this place is going to flood, and it's going to flood regularly, so we will allow you to actually raise the sill of the windows and dry floodproof the building to try and keep the water out. Floodproofing also includes, doing the sandbags at the door. It's a very temporary flood proofing method. In this example, They actually, it became a semi-permanent version, but should be temporary. And another option is to actually install flood barriers at things like doors and window openings. So the panels on the left slide into the channels on either sides of the doors and windows, and they have gaskets, which are kind of rubber, gaskets are sort of like the rubber you have on a car window that has to be maintained regularly, and it provides a seal against the water trying to come in. But that doesn't, keep all the water out. So you also have to have secondary things like sump pumps to clean it up and get the water out. So another option for historic buildings is relocation. Similar to elevating a building, relocation includes picking a building up off its foundation after you've disconnected all the building systems, et cetera, that come up, and then preparing a new site, moving that building to the new site, and lowering it down and reconnecting everything. So the National Park Service has a lot of information about relocation, when it's appropriate, when it's not appropriate, et cetera. That should be used as the general guide. So you're looking for a setting in which you're maintaining the historic qualities of the original setting at the new site. So if the property's relationship to the water was important, or to a railroad line was important, or to a commercial main street was important, you're trying your best to maintain all of those same characteristics at the new site. You also want to reinstitute, to the degree possible, landscape elements and features, including fences and trees and secondary buildings at the new site. One of the technical challenges with relocating a building, and yes, you can move anything, is the physical getting it there part of it. So if you think about the size of a building, and that it has to be lifted up and put on rollers or tracks, or lots of different ways to do it, you have to be able to get it under telephone lines, electric lines, around corners, under bridges, over bridges, etc., to its new site. So all of those things can be very limiting in the process. So sometimes historic buildings are so damaged you can't save them. And one of the mitigation options for that is actually acquisition and demolition. So FEMA has a program where they can acquire properties that have been substantially damaged, and that's actually, there's a technical definition of that, a FEMA definition for that. They can acquire substantially damaged buildings and basically buy out the property owner and demolish the building. When you demolish a building, you have to basically do the best you can, the best way to demolish a building is not only to tear the building down, but also, to the extent possible, restore the site on which the building sits to its original landscape setting. So remove the building, the garage, any tanks or wells or anything that had been added. And then if this was historically more of a wetland or an open field, try to restore the site back to that, and you're restoring some of the drainage properties of the site originally. The last mitigation option is really migration. And that's accepting that some buildings or some places are so prone to flooding that you can't live there anymore. So this is an example from the Chesapeake Bay. So the Chesapeake Bay is rising at a rate where they estimate that by 2050 it will rise 2.1 feet. And by 2100 it will rise over 4 feet. And the reality is that they're losing a lot of jobs. A lot of industry is shutting down, schools are shutting down, and things like schools are harder to get to, and they can't cross the bridges when the tide is high. So people are leaving some of these places. So as a preservation minded audience, we have to think about what these places mean to us historically and how we're going to tell the story of how these people lived there. So thinking about, where we see current sea levels and current mitigation options for historic properties today versus long term is important. Because even if this house was 20 feet in the air, if the road is closed and there's no fresh water, can we still live here? And the answer in many cases is no. And again, another example from the Chesapeake, but increasingly it's going to be harder to mitigate our way out of some of this climate change and some of the sea level rise. So we have to do our best to really figure out how we want to live and to what extent we feel comfortable in making changes to our historic properties and allow some of those changes to occur so that we can enjoy them as long as we can. Also, I want to mention that Kate showed the National Park Service's flood mitigation guidelines. They are anticipated to be illustrated early in 2021 and redistributed with pictures. So hopefully there'll be some other pictures beside those ones I've been showing to help guide this discussion. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Dominique and Kate. That was just tremendous. Kate, could you turn your camera on as well and your audio? And we just can't thank you enough for the wonderful presentation. So we now have some time to get to questions that people have been typing into the chat box. And folks, you can continue to type questions because we have some time. I'm going to turn over to my colleague, Dr. Carrie Ferraro, who's been diligently monitoring the chat box, and she'll direct your questions to our speakers. Carrie, take it away.
Thank you so much, Marjorie. And thank you, Dominique and Kate, for such wonderful presentations. Our first question is from Jenny Wolf. She asks, during a building elevation, do you notice a major difference in cost of going straight up versus shifting a building on the lot to allow more front yard space for graduated access to the front door? Or is the resulting impact to the streetscape more negatively affected?
So I think that's really a case-by-case circumstance. So in looking at, I'm sorry, somebody has a lot of feedback. In looking at some of the options I was showing relative to, trying to manage the staircases, so to speak, which is really what the game became. I think in some settings it would be more inappropriate to push the building back. If you have a real consistency of streetscape, I think it can be more visually jarring to push the building back to maintain that straight run. But it's also a question of how the community sets its priorities. And this is, again, where each local historical commission, I think, has to make their own choices about what are the overriding things that they are hoping to achieve and what is the character that they're hoping to maintain. Kate, did you want to add to that?
No, I think you did a great job of answering the question.
Thank you so much. Okay, so this is for both Kate and Dominique. Can you describe what triggers you're seeing in New Jersey for either homeowners or municipalities factoring in changes in precipitation, not participation, inland flooding for historic properties? Do you need me to repeat that question because I messed it up? Yeah. Okay. The question was, sorry, can you describe what kind of triggers you're seeing here in New Jersey for homeowners or municipalities, thinking about how changes in precipitation, that's a word, and inland flooding are going to impact historic properties? What are some of these trigger points that you're seeing for residents or municipalities?
So I think from the Historic Preservation Office's perspective, given that we only review projects kind of under very limited circumstances when certain regulations or regulatory contexts apply. I think the triggers that we see is that there's an availability of federal funding, that the federal agencies make funding available to, different communities to complete mitigation projects. And then, similar to that, there are communities, municipalities, and counties that have begun to think about how they can, build in some more resilience into flooding in their communities. And so there might also be triggered by there's a funding source that is available for them to tap into to contemplate some of these resilience projects.
So one of the things I will add, and this is really a crossover to the previous conversation we had, is that FEMA actually doesn't get involved in most flooding events. And it's a misnomer to think that FEMA is going to drop in from outer space and fix our flood problems when our house gets flooded. They get involved in only in the instances where there's a presidential disaster declaration related to the flood. So most flooding is really on the individual property owner to handle it through their own means, or if they have flood insurance through with the assistance of the flood insurance. The other thing to keep in mind is that properties flood, even those that are not in the special flood hazard area. So property owners, I think, assume or monitor their own level of risk and decide whether or not they want to do something to protect their own property. And that can be both inland as well as along, the coastline, so to speak. So different municipalities are looking at the collective impact of flooding in their municipalities, and whether it's flooding from a creek that floods, a river that floods, or an ocean that floods, it's still flooding. And that they are establishing their own regulatory framework to address that. Ellicott City in Maryland is a prime example where they had two 1,000-year floods 2 years in a row, or 2 years apart, excuse me. So they are an inland, it was a riverine flooding situation. So each municipality is going to make its own decision and its own policy choices about how to mitigate flooding in their community.
Great answers, thank you, especially considering that I messed up the question twice for you guys. Our next question is whether you have any insights on whether homeowners insurance or flood insurance rates have gone down for these homeowners once they've made the changes, all the alterations.
I would suspect so, because the level of risk changes. And one of the things you can do as a property owner is, if you feel that your property is mischaracterized for its flood risk, there are things you can do to challenge that, including getting what's known as an elevation certificate, which is a civil engineer or a surveyor basically goes out and documents the actual height of the living surface of your house. Because flood maps, as we look at them, are really measuring ground plane. They're not measuring where you live. So if you have a basement, that basement is below the ground plane, so that is more vulnerable. But if everything in your house is above the first floor, meaning you have no heating systems or electrical circuit breakers and things in the basement, and everything's above the first floor, and you have nothing in the basement, then your flood risk is actually lower. So you can get what's known as an elevation certificate and prove to the National Flood Insurance Program, hey, my first floor is 2 feet above where you say it needs to be, so I'm not as at risk. You can have your flood insurance lowered. So I would suspect that by going through this process, you can in fact have your flood insurance lowered. When I bought my house, I checked where I was relative to the floodplain, and I'm not in it, so I haven't had to deal with it.
Kate, did you have anything to add, or?
Unfortunately, I don't think that we're in the position to get to know from homeowners whether or not they have, any changes to their flood insurance premiums. So I don't think I have anything to add to that.
Thank you. So our next question is from Chelsea. She asked what kind of resources there were basically to support communities to chart mitigation measures for residential and commercial historic properties, whether there were resources to help develop for workshops or developing guides, and whether there would be potentially through like a FEMA mitigation grant that might be able to help with that. Basically, what resources were there for communities for this planning process?
Based upon my limited experience, a lot of the flood mitigation resources are actually being paid for through recovery efforts such as post-Sandy. So I happen to do a commercial guide for the Manioc neighborhood of Philadelphia that specifically addressed commercial buildings. So, and part of it is some of the rules that apply to commercial buildings are different than residential buildings. So I think as I'll let Kate speak towards it, but as resources become available, I know there are certain topics that people want covered.
So I guess, first of all, I would suggest that people could take a look at the elevation design guidelines that Dominique prepared for the New Jersey Historic Preservation Office, because there is a lot of great information in there about flood resiliency and historic buildings. I would also say that for communities that participate in our Certified Local Governments program, there are grant funds that are available to those communities to undertake projects such as design guidelines. If communities wanted to begin thinking about how they could incorporate flood adaptation measures into their design guidelines for their communities.
Thank you so much. Our next question is from TJ, and TJ asks, when raising homes post-flooding, are they generally exempt from building height requirements, or is it case by case? Have many shore towns readopted an ordinance that allows or encourages the raising of homes?
So I won't speak towards the specifics of towns or the percentage that have adopted it, but one of the challenges that this runs into is as you're elevating, or zoning usually establishes height maximums for certain, zoning districts within every municipality. So there is a maximum height you can go. If to keep your house safe, you have to raise your house 4 feet, 5 feet, whatever it might be, some homes actually abut or exceed that maximum height. I think communities are getting a lot more, I won't say smarter, but a lot more aware of the fact that in terms of trying to save historic houses, they may have to relax some of those heights, or maybe relax them specifically in a manner that allows elevations to occur if they want to save those historic resources. So I think this is a work in progress in a lot of places where municipalities are rewriting some of those rules. The other problem that happens with these rules is sometimes for new construction in that context, so keep in mind, we're trying to raise all these buildings to the same height, you end up with these, instead of lovely gabled roofs that are all similar on a street, you end up with these sort of squashed roofs that come down because they're abutting that height requirement of local municipalities. So I think it's really a question of working with the zoning officer of the community and thinking about what the architectural character is relative to the zoning ordinance to try and make those things jive. So you get the outcome you're hoping to get.
Great, thank you. So we also had a couple of questions related to kind of equity and gentrification. So one of the questions was, how have most of the property owners paid for the projects? And are you seeing a change in real estate market where people who may be of lower socioeconomic status are priced out of their ability to floodproof historic buildings?
Again, haven't done a survey of this, but yes. The short answer is yes. Unfortunately, this is not an inexpensive process. And I think those people who have the means to get to the end that needs to be gotten to will always benefit in this process. And yes, it is displacing people, particularly if people don't have the financial means to recover from a flood or don't have flood insurance. So in the instance where you inherited your grandparents' house down the shore, if it floods and you can't fix it, you'll probably end up selling, and somebody will build something bigger and taller on that parcel. So yeah, there are real equity issues associated with this.
And I think I would just add to that again, since the Historic Preservation Office would review any project receiving federal funding, we have seen, particularly in the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy and the recovery efforts, that there was a lot of funding that was provided by Housing and Urban Development to individual homeowners to cover some of the costs of elevating their buildings, their homes.
Thank you. So Dominique, you talked a little bit about why dry proofing is not compliant with the NFIP for residential properties. You talked about how it's really difficult to get this done, to plug all the holes and kind of put that wetsuit on it. But could you speak a little more about why it's not compliant?
I can't channel FEMA to that degree, but I will say the one perception I have, having read more FEMA publications than I care to admit, is that they prioritize homeowner safety above all else. And it's an engineering challenge to actually dry flood proof a building successfully. And maintaining safe housing for people is a priority of FEMA, and I would venture to say that you need, it's a very technically challenging thing to do, and its chance of failure fairly high. And at a commercial level, you might lose a commercial building or its contents. But at a homeowner level, I think you're really impacting people's lives in a different way. And this is my feeling the best possible thoughts for FEMA in terms of trying to keep us safe. Having said that, if you find that keeping sandbags at your front door or doing some sort of a barrier system, and there are some real simple barriers you can do at your front door, may keep the flood water out, which is terrific. It just won't lower your flood insurance. So you can still do some of these things, but you won't get a reduced premium if you have to have flood insurance. If you inherited your grandmother's house and you love it, but you don't want to pay the insurance, and you think that some barrier at the doors and abandoning the basement will keep as much water out as you need, go for it. It's better to keep the water out. It just won't, financially change your flood insurance, and it's not really changing your flood risk also.
Thank you. So our next question is, in Florida, PACE programs can be used to finance storm resiliency measures, in addition to energy efficiency. Has there been any discussion of that in New Jersey that either of you are aware of?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. So next question is, for homeowners that have flood-proofed, have they found high success in terms of their next instance of flood? Basically, are some of these approaches really working?
Well, since residential floodproofing is really elevating a building or wet floodproofing, so wet floodproofing, you're just saying, okay, I'm going to let the water come in, and the water will go out when the water is ready to leave. That's pretty easy. As long as you can hose it down and clean it up, then that's considered successful, because you've sort of saved the living space of your house. In elevating, it's a question of whether or not you've elevated enough for the risk at hand. So if the storm is so bad that it exceeds the height you've elevated and you get water in your house, then I would say that's unsuccessful. So I think it depends on the circumstance.
Thank you. And someone wrote in, David wrote in that their flood insurance premiums rose from about $2,000 a year to almost $13,000. And so he's waiting to get his 250-year-old house lifted up because he does see that this would be helpful. Okay. Yeah.
And one thing to keep in mind with that, it's going to keep going up. The number of storms, as we tune into the Weather Channel, so to speak, we're on the greatest number of storms this calendar year than we have been. And whether that storm occurs in Florida, in Louisiana, in Texas, all of the insurance is from the same pool of money. So the flood insurance rates are going up.
Great point. So I think our last question is, we talked a lot about flooding and historic properties. Just if you had anything you wanted to add about, extreme heat, which is going to be another impact of climate change, so how would this extreme heat impact these historic houses?
Well, I will do this only from the information I read. I don't claim to be a climate scientist, but some of the things to think about with flooding. So extreme heat, my understanding, raises the height of sea levels, and climate change, the whole intersection of extreme heat, climate change, and sea level rise is very intertwined. So the seas will keep rising as a result. So every storm that you get is going to be that much more severe. If your baseline water is higher, then the same storm today versus 20 years from now will have a greater impact. So if you think about it as a cumulative effect, the heat is going to increase. The other things that we didn't talk about is what I'll call secondary damage related to flooding. So the waves, which we didn't really talk about, can knock buildings off of foundation. The wind can blow off roofs. You can also get secondary effects such as downed electrical lines, which can start fires, ruptured gas lines, which can start fires. So there's a lot more to this than just flooding. So all of these things are really intertwined, and we have to really start thinking about resilience as a cumulative effect of all of it together. And I don't pretend to have all the answers, but somebody's going to figure it out.
Yeah, no, great answer. And I agree. I don't think anybody has all the answers. So thank you so much. I think that's all the questions we have. Marjorie, did you want to add something? Thank you both.
So on behalf of all of us here at the New Jersey Climate Change Resource Center, we'd like to once again thank Kate Marcopul and Dominique Hawkins for their really fantastic presentation today. It's been wonderful. We hope everybody who's on the line will join us for our next Climate Academy. It'll be later this week on Thursday, November 12th at 11:30. We'll be joined by Kathy Fallon-Lambert of the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, who'll speak on the Transportation Equity, Climate and Health Research Study analyzing air quality and activity mobility benefits of transportation policy scenarios. So that concludes today's event, and thank you.